was I was reading, watching some videos and reading articles on Alberta there. So
Oh, we'll get to Alberta. Okay. Well, one thing we didn't cover yesterday was the Trump administration probe is going to be probing Harvard University and the Harvard Law Review. And the reason they're doing this is because the the Trump administration's basically in having issues. They're basically saying that law review editors may have engaged in race-based discrimination in violation of the Civil Rights Act 1964. Wow.
yeah, and they're trying to control the the resistance they have from the um, resistance they have from universities, and based on anti-Semitism, or at least that's their sort of
Take, yeah.
take is that anti-Semitism is a real problem, and that the university has to change its way of doing things. It is woke, basically. The university is woke, and in this particular case, they eye up. Now let's go back a bit. They are withdrawing funding from University of Harvard, and that funding is very essential to lots of medical research that's being done. The idea is that Trump is trying to control the narrative of the universities, and by doing this, and by going after the legal and other politicians, and the media, the way he's done, he's trying to control the narrative and control the message. However, Harvard has had a problem. So my point when I put this up there, that they have a real issue here, where they say that a someone with a review was put forward that was written by a minority, got preferential treatment over others. And what they're saying, they're using the civil rights basic issues that go back to 1964, that they're excluding races, and particularly white people and men, and they're going to have to change their
Well,
way.
there's an irony here, is that there have been complaints about the fact that about the view that white men are being excluded, and white men have been largely excluded. There's been a reaction. Whether it's right or wrong is immaterial to this discussion. There's been a reaction over the years that has said that, hey, women and people of minorities have not gotten into places like Harvard, so therefore we have to now redress the balance, and we're going to do so by excluding white men. And I personally think that exclusion is wrong, because you're going to have some absolute brilliant scholars who don't get the support they need from the system.
Yes, and to be true, like a fellow by the name of Steven Pinker, who is a professor there and who's a Canadian, very famous philosopher, thinker. He has been part of what is called the Council of Academic Freedom in Harvard.
Yeah.
The Council of Academic Freedom has recognized there is a problem in Harvard. And he points out an example that when he was on the hiring committee of a certain department, that when somebody came to them and presented their sort of credentials, that person was very much a liberal thinker, very much to the left of center in their political thinking. That was all exposed, and that the person did not deny any of that. But that person said that they were against affirmative action. They did not believe in affirmative action. When that person left the room, and when they were deciding which person to get, they pointed out this particular person. Well, we can't have him. He's obviously a racist. And Pinker said, "What?" He says, "Well, he's against affirmative action, so therefore he must be a racist, and we don't need him here." That's the kind of narrow.
That's a stupid, narrow-minded conclusion.
Yes. Now the Council of Academic Freedom that was organized within the university was made up to combat that kind of narrow thinking. And he said it was a kind of a culture that started to exist in Harvard, and policies were designed around it that were not confirmed or were not given the thumbs up by any of the universities. It's just kind of a culture that creeped in to the Harvard. Now, on the other hand, Pinker is also fighting the notion that the Trump administration can come now and intrude in the into the administration on who it hires and its ideological bent. Now, it seems that Harvard is trying to correct that with the Council of Academic Freedoms and trying to right the ship, basically, take it away from that wokeness that we talked about there. And if they're rejecting a person because they are against affirmative action, and you can find lots of minorities and women who are against affirmative action, they want to be hired based on their merits, not based on that.
We were talking about that in relation to the Carney government yesterday. And how Carney is much more of a merits-based person than, and if you leave things to their merits, you'll get a natural settling down. Of course, you'll get a swing of more women in one era than more men in another era, but it'll kind of move so there's evenness in the thing. But the thing is that evenness doesn't always happen. It's like, you might have more men in a department today, but in 3 years' time, you've got more women in the department. It swings roundabouts, and it's not because it's not anything to do with selection criteria pushing it that way. It's even if you were to actually say, we're going to only recruit the best people for the job, you're getting a natural swing in either direction anyway, because last year you recruited 3 men because the 3 men were the best for the job. Next year, you're going to be recruiting 3 women because they happen to be the best for the job.
Now, on the surface, it sounds like the right thing to do. It says here, Harvard Law Review article, selection process appears to pick winners and losers on the basis of race, employing a spoil system in which the race of the legal scholar is as, if not more, important than the merit of the submission. Craig Traynor, the Education Department's acting assistant secretary for civil rights, said. So they're using civil rights, basically, kind of.
It's interesting, because it's an interesting the way that they've used it. Okay, so I'm looking right now at Harvard Law Review. All right. The headline article right now is excited delirium, policing and law of evidence. And this is by somebody named of Asagi K. Obasagi. Right?
Yep.
Okay. If I just go into the second article, that's a composite article. So
well, it says here right from the beginning that the very first paragraph, it says U.S. President Donald Trump's administration on Monday said it was probing whether Harvard University and Harvard Law Review violated civil rights when the journal's editors fast-tracked consideration of an article written by a member of a racial minority. And this is what, however, the news of the new probe came hours after the federal judge agreed to expedite Harvard University's lawsuit seeking to block the Trump administration of freezing more than $2 billion in federal grant funding that Ivy League school has warned will threaten vital medical and scientific research. Is it really the intent of the government to fix the sort of wokeness of Harvard, basically, or is it a means by which to control Harvard? If they were really the $2 billion they are withholding will seriously interrupt medical research. And Steven Pinker pointed this out too, that recently a lot of discoveries at Harvard have saved a lot of lives. And what you're doing now is you're interrupting that process. So if you really wanted to change the Harvard and bring its issues to bear, why would you cripple them? Particularly in areas of medical research where it really hasn't got much to do with DEI or any other those kind of things, because that's pretty much straight-laced medical research. It really doesn't involve political viewpoints in that.
Yeah, I'm looking at Harvard Law Review right now, and I'm trying to see if there is any. The only article that I see anything is the headline article, which was by this person called Asagi Obazogi, right? And none of the other articles that are in here actually show any form of headline information at all about who wrote them.
Yeah, but the idea, the fear from Harvard, even though they recognize they have these problems, as I said, over a year ago, they organized a committee called the Council of Academic Freedom, which saw that in Harvard, the free speech and the freedom of academic freedom was inhibited by the wokeness of the university, by certain departments becoming dominated by certain points of view, where you are not going to pass if you do not take on the professor's point of view on something. For instance, if you were to say affirmative action doesn't work, you may, in your paper, you may fail that paper because it doesn't comply with the ideas of the professor. In real university, a professor may take a position historically or whatever else and invite anyone to contradict their theory. And if it is well written and it has basis of information, then that, no matter how much it conflicts with the sort of attitudes of the professor, they will still win. They will still get a good mark. They will still be judged fairly.
Well, that's the way it should be.
Yeah, that's the problem of Harvard and other universities have had. And Steven Pinker, although he's not himself not a conservative, has pointed out that only 3% of the professors in Harvard are conservative, which he finds a problem with, because you're not going to get a balanced opinion. And the hiring practices of Harvard have made it so, where you have conservative voices being marginalized, very much so. If you only have 3% of the professors, identifying as conservative.
Yeah. Okay, and it's a problem, and the problem just doesn't, is, I can see actually that schools are going to be the challenge for the Trump administration anyway.
Well, the fact is that the government is trying to impose what appears on the surface as reasonable ideas to level the playing fields in university. The way it's worded and the approach they're using is one of threats and forcing the universities to adapt what the government says is how they should employ themselves. This gives the government control over the voices of the universities. That's worse than what is happening in the universities today. Where you did have this sort of woke sensorialism going on in the universities and this sort of heavily biased approach to ideas that was regrettable, and that outfits like the Council of Academic Freedom have tried to fight. Having the government impose itself on the universities and dictate how they're supposed to be run is a means by which to control the university and the voices out of it.
Yeah.
Steven Pinker himself, and now a lot of this was ostensibly based on anti-Semitism during the protests of the Gaza war. Pinker points out that he is a Jew and that other Jewish, he says hundreds of Jewish faculty are against this imposition of the Trump regime, and it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with anti-Semitism. That's not the way to deal with it. So they're using it as an excuse to drive a wedge into the administration of these universities. They do have a problem.
Yeah. That's what I say. I don't think it's just Harvard. It's Harvard's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
But Harvard's likely to survive because it has private funding.
It has a lot of private funding, but a lot of this money that they're withholding is going to medical research, apparently.
Well, but Trump is actually trying to stop medical research anyway.
I'm not so sure. I think his buddy RFK may have issues with that, because even though he's kind of a little bit on the edge, he does realize that medical research, how important it is. Now you have what Pinker has pointed out, is you have that Harvard University employs a lot of different people around the country in different departments, and you're going to get a lot of layoffs and people having had very expensive research going on that has to be stopped. Not only does that lay off a lot of people, but it now wastes the money of the medical research that Congress has given the schools. So you're now putting in danger the ongoing research that's going on right now. Is that really the way to go about this? No. If you were the real government, you would put the proposals you have for changing the university and kind of fixing its sort of wokish approach to things, and you could hold the money as a kind of a stick. But the fact of the matter is, if you really wanted things to change like that, you wouldn't do it this way.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do it bluntly like this. You would bring up these issues, and in this particular case, they're using the civil rights, where a person of people of certain races are getting their work accredited quicker than somebody else, and that they point out that the race was much more important than the merits of the article, and they're using the old 1964 Civil Rights Act to point that out, which is fair, which is very fair. However, what is the real intent?
Yeah, and it's the real intent that actually matters, and basically it's merits. We should be merits based, but hey, academia lives on a different planet sometimes.
It's almost like a liver, like in universities do have a kind of a disease going on there. They have, um, and I'll compare it with, they're almost like a religion. Like we know the story of Galileo. Galileo confirmed what Copernicus had said. However, it was contrary uh, to what the church had accepted. The church had accepted and called true the Ptolemaic method, by which the Earth was the center of the universe. And when Galileo came up with the alternate and proved what Copernicus had observed, and other scientists as well, Kepler and so on, had already observed and pointed that out, he was thought to be um, irreligious. In fact, a troublemaker. He was contrary to the church's opinion. Therefore, he must be evil. He took a point of view that was contrary to the ideas
Yeah.
of the church. Therefore, whether he was right or wrong, he was wrong because he was irreligious. When you start to use identity politics and you accept the view that that everything has to do with race, and all things, all manner of developments of human civilization has to do with race, and and take that as your orthodoxy, and then no other opinion is accepted. Just like Copernicus's opinion could not be accepted because it was against the orthodoxy of the leading thinkers of the time.
Yeah.
That's the problem that Pinker sees.
Yeah.
Basically, something like that. There's a certain orthodoxy. If you don't fit that, like you're against affirmative action, you must be a racist to draw that conclusion.
Well, that's an incorrect conclusion anyway. But okay.
Of course, anybody with a mind would think so, but the belief system in the minds of the university officials make that make that kind of make that thinking go supplant reasonable logical thinking. If you assume just because somebody is against affirmative action, they therefore must be racist, and just like Galileo, just because he accepted the fact that the sun is in the middle of the solar system, he therefore must be irreligious, and we can't accept his science.
Yeah. Well, it's ironic that ancient science, prior to the Ptolemaic system, the Greeks accepted that the sun was at the center of the solar system, and other religious beliefs also accepted that the sun was at the center of our solar system, and further that we were just one planet amongst one solar system amongst many.
That didn't fit with the church thinking of the time, and they had accepted Ptolemai's view as.
No, but what I'm saying is that's not exactly a new thinking. You go into like, for example, Sanskrit thinking, ancient Indian philosophy. That scientific way is accepted.
Well, the Greeks had
And it was
various
by the Greeks
ideas. Many of
earlier.
the Greeks thought that there was something like the Earth going around the sun, and that they're very, very close. However, the Ptolemaic system explained things very well, and when the church accepted, the religious authority accepted it, then any other view was unacceptable.
Yeah, I know.
And that's the same sort of idea when you get identity politics. Once you accept that that must be the source of civilization and the conflicts within civilization, then anything that counters that or argues against that must be rejected. It's almost like a religious dogma.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I think we can kind of put an end to this Harvard University article.
I'll just conclude that the Trump administration could have done this in many different ways. It's looking for popularity and populist sort of thinking. There's many different ways it could have addressed this if it really wanted to address this in
True.
a positive way. And what it did instead is tried to control the narrative coming out of universities.
Yeah.
And we'll see how that works forward.
Yeah. All right.
That
So
would also meant the very same person, Steven Pinker, who was among those who started the Council of Academic Freedom to correct this within the University of Harvard, is also the guy who points out that what Trump is doing is more to control thinking than to help it along.
yeah. Okay. So okay. Okay, so we're moving on from that, and welcome to Talking Niagara, everybody. It's the last day of April 2025, and yeah, we've got a number of things to discuss here. First, moving on to Trump eases the tariffs on the US automakers, but it still could potentially have a negative impact upon Canadian jobs.
Yeah, the Trump administration seems not to be fully aware of the complications of what their tariff implies. So they have been heavily lobbied, according to this article, by automakers, saying you're going to make a real mess the way you're doing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we've already seen that the Trump administration has tried to simplify their tariffs and the parts that are in the car. But still, that's very, very difficult to do. And even if they wanted to do what they wanted to do, it would take an enormous sort of a bureaucratic effort and a lot of time to identify what is a foreign part, what is a
That's always bothered me, because in fact, actually, here's the thing. So if you've just got one line that's making, let's say, 4 Tauruses, right? So one car, this car is going to be more expensive because it's got foreign parts in it than this car, next one on the line, because it doesn't have foreign parts in it. Because in the first one, half the parts came from various parts of the world, and on the second one, they're all US made. How would you can't do that. That amounts to stupidity.
Yeah, so it doesn't kind of make sense the way he's doing it. I think a lot of people, even if they accept the fact that it would be really nice to make all these parts here in the United States, and to take all the jobs from Canada and Mexico that is involved in the auto parts and bring them to the United States, that takes a very long time. Now, that's number one. It takes a very long time, and if you start charging tariffs the way you want to, then that's not only does it increase the cost of the car, but it confuses the market, and it slows things down because of the government has to now intrude with tariff controls and departments of tariffs. So, and Trump has already excluded some of the parts made by the USMCA deal, but I think his whole administration is very confused how to deal with this. The idea is, of course, is to close down all the plants in Canada and Mexico and bring them into the United States. This, particularly with Canada, is very difficult because the auto industry has been blended basically between the United States and Canada since 1965.
Yeah.
How are you going to do that? So it's a very complicated.
And in fact, when you've got things like what happens between Windsor and Detroit, essentially, I got the impression that there's a plant in the plant in Detroit brings up the plant in Windsor and says, "Hey, we need a couple of dozen of these parts just to tide us over for the day. Can you supply?" And they ship them across the border.
But one of the big problems is the layering over of tariffs. So you've got that drive shaft that begins its life in Ontario, then gets machined, crosses the border, gets tariffed, and then is machined by someplace in the United States, then comes back into Canada to be installed. So there you have two border crossings right there that tariffs would add onto the value of the car. And when the car does come in, there's going to be another tariff on top of that. So they really are confused on how they're going to apply these tariffs.
Yeah.
It is it is an unthought of. So even if you want all the cars built in the United States and all the parts, that takes a whole lot of time.
Yeah.
And in the meantime,
that's a
10-year
plan.
If you keep tariffing these parts, you're going to push the car price up.
Yeah.
And also the back and forth battles between the three countries, Mexico, US, and Canada, along auto lines, then inhibits investment because no one knows where this is going to go. So they withdraw investment and they start laying off workers until they find out what the hell is going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and this to me has always been the problem with the tariff stuff, right? Mike says it's time for Canada to say if it's to be sold in Canada, 50% must be made in Canada.
Yeah, well,
and you've been saying that for some time. I know that, Mike.
Yeah, I know that if a car is built in Ontario, let's say a Toyota, and if you add the whole worth of the car, more of it's Canadian. Let's say like a RAV that I've got is made in Cambridge, but I know the engines come from certain places, and there's all if you add the whole worth of the car, including assembly, it would be more than 51% Canadian, basically the worth of the car. But it would mean that 49% of it came from other places. So, yeah, you could say that it was built in Canada, but it was built with cars internationally.
Yeah, but again, again, that depends upon where each individual part comes from. And as I say, if you could have gearboxes that are going in, into a line of cars that's built in a factory where some come from Canada, some come from the US, and some come from Mexico.
Yeah, well, exactly. But let's say in the case of Toyota, a lot of the parts would come from Japan, obviously.
Yeah, and obviously somewhere. Yeah, and exactly. I wasn't going to even venture outside of those three, but yes, you're right.
So if you look at the car, let's say RAV, and 51% of the worth of the car is Canadian. The steel, the labor, other things, and the other parts come from different areas, but the value of the car is 51% Canadian, and then it is deemed to be a Canadian-made car.
Yeah.
And so if Canada was to tariff that and want to bring all the parts manufacturing of a Toyota RAV into Canada, then it would have to tariff the wheels that might come from Mexico or the engine that might come from Japan, and so on and so forth. So you would build up the cost of that. So that's very, very interesting. But there's these temporary reprieves of the tariffs on car parts to relieve the U.S. automakers is only temporary. And the problems of tariff problems, even if you agree with the tariff ideology, is not facilitated by the way in which these tariffs are being applied. You have to have a system by which it's a little bit more reasonable and logical before you can start doing that. And that's what's got the auto plants all flipped upside down.
Yeah.
Plus the fact that it takes a couple of years to get a plant. If you just wanted to make piston rings in the United States, let's say, you'd have to set up a plant to make piston rings.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Anything else on that?
No, but I will take a little bit of a segue here. Amazon was getting in a lot of trouble, and Jeff Bezos getting in a lot of trouble just in the last couple of days because they had considered putting the price of the tariff on their goods that they sell online. So, for instance, if you buy a pair of shoes, they'll put the price of the pair of shoes and they'll identify how much of that
Oh,
is
so,
tariffs.
so 125 for the price of shoes and 25 for tariffs type thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And let's say the pair of shoes came from China, so it would be $245 for a pair of shoes that's $100, and they would put $100 for the shoes and $145 for the tariff. So they would identify the tax on it. The White House
I
says
doubt
this,
the White House likes that.
no, they say it's a politically motivated move.
Yeah.
And because a lot of the Americans right now, as they're selling the tariff thing, haven't never out of the White House said where that money's coming from. They say they're making money on tariffs, and the idea is that other countries are paying the tariffs still in the mind of most Americans. When they glaringly see how much the tariff is adding onto it, then they'll have a different view of the tariffs. That's what the White House is worried about.
Yeah.
They say it's politically motivated, but when you buy something, you have the taxes on your receipt, don't you? Anything you buy.
Well, and in fact, actually, yeah, exactly. So you buy a product, and it's on your receipt. It does show that, hey, you paid GST of $3.59 or whatever the GST was, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
all applicable taxes are on your receipt. So
Yeah.
when you buy something from Amazon, it shows you the taxes and it
Yeah.
shows you the import duty if there is any.
Yeah.
So those things are put on your receipt anyway. So don't you think we have the right to know how much of the price is tariff, which is a
Yeah.
tax?
Yep. And
But
I would agree with Jeff Bezos.
yeah, I would say that. Now, does Jeff Bezos have a political motivation here to sort of push the White House into realizing that once they start putting the tariff prices on it and people realize that, they won't be so happy about tariffs in the long run?
And in fact, actually, what Bezos is saying is that, hey, we here at Amazon doing our best to keep prices down. We us, you trust us, you've been with us for a number of years. You know that Amazon offers the best price point ratios that we can offer our customers. But if the price has gone up, don't blame us, is what they're saying, more or less, isn't it?
Basically, and you do have the right to view the full bill. So if you're buying a pair of shoes for $245, and because they came from China, and it's clearly pointed out that $145 of that price is tariff that you are paying, that makes it very clear to the consumer who still doesn't understand that the tariffs are consumer paid, because you don't see that coming out of the White House. The White House does not describe it. Say, we're making a lot of money off tariffs. Tariffs are beautiful, and we're just making our country a lot of money. But nowhere in the White House narrative saying we're going to make so much money because the pair of shoes that you're going to buy, the government's going to make you pay another $145 that's going to go to taxes. Nowhere do they say that ever. They just talk about this tariff thing as money coming from offshore, or at least that's the implication. They don't say that directly, but they never describe how tariffs work from the White House point of view.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So the Liberals dropped the ball in Niagara and York, and particularly Niagara. They lost two seats that they had targeted, being Niagara Falls and Niagara on the Lake, and Niagara South. They had targeted and expected to win those seats, and Vance Badaway was a well-known, well-respected local Liberal MP who didn't get in. Instead, a Conservative won in both, and in Niagara and Niagara Falls, Niagara on the Lake, Andrea Kaiser was ahead in the polls for quite some time, and yet on the day they blew it. So that's where the criticism is coming about. This is about the Liberals, by the way.
Yeah, now the Liberals immediately assumed that the NDP vote would shift their way. In the country as a whole, half the seats that the NDP lost went to Conservatives, and half went to Liberals.
Yeah,
the Liberals were assuming that the NDP supporters would then shift directly to the Liberals because they're more left of center than the Conservatives. But the Conservatives picked up half of those, and that's because of the conservative narrative. He says here, because the conservative narrative was a lot more about affordability and the things that the common people are most worried about: affordability, housing, and things like that. That's the message that played out here on the border, and it really bucks the trend, because this is a border area, and the Liberals really expected that their message about Trump would resonate here much more than it would anywhere else, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is that prior to the election, the polls in both these ridings, both these Niagara ridings that ended up in the Conservative hands, were saying that it was pretty evenly split. In fact, Niagara South, they were predicting quite a resounding victory for the Liberals.
Now, to be fair to Vance Badaway, his whole district got realigned. So
it's true. It's true. I'm not. You know, you can't. It's a crapshoot when that happens to you, to him as an MP. And I know from people who know Vance Badaway that he was regarded as a very good constituency MP.
Yeah, but they realigned his district, and it incorporated areas that typically vote for Conservative.
Yes,
so and the narrative that the Liberals were pushing throughout the rest of the country did not resonate here, where you would expect it to resonate, because this is a border town.
Yeah,
and the conflicts between the economies on both sides of the river, we would think it would resonate in the Niagara area. It did not. It did not resonate in York either, which was a very big surprise to the pollsters. And but we found here, in as we pointed out on this show, if you go back to Wayne Gates winning this riding again, and Baldinelli winning his, that the people here seem to be voting for the person a lot of the times, not so much for the issues.
That's very true. We know that. Yeah.
Baldinelli says his issues were more poignant to the people here in Niagara, but the fact is, people like him. And the same as Wayne Gates, Wayne Gates in a sea of blue, you would have expected the winds of change to have affected us here. And the Conservatives did not. The provincial Conservatives did not make any ground.
Provincial Conservatives made no ground. In fact, the result was better for Wayne Gates than it had been at the previous election with Bob Gale opposing him.
I think it's what they say here is that this area has a unique political ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that we were the spoilers of because we went contrary to what the Liberals anticipated. The NDP vote shifting towards the Liberals didn't happen in mass like he thought. The vote was probably split between the Liberals and
just take these two ridings, right? These two ridings in Niagara. the difference would be Liberals sitting 169 right now. Those two ridings, had they gone to the Liberals, would mean that the Liberals would be on 171. Key difference, right? Because
Yeah.
at 171, they would have a practical. They would have to have the unified force of all the other parties opposed to them.
Yeah, and if you take York, which was under the same ideas that it should have swung to the Liberals, compared to what the rest of the country was doing, and it did not.
Yeah.
Between York and Niagara, we're the ones that upset
but again,
the full government, the full majority government.
But again, we can also point this out that the first riding to flip was amongst the first 5 that were declared. This was Long Range Mountains in Newfoundland and Labrador. Long Range Mountains went from Liberal to Conservative, right? That should have been, they dropped the ball there as well. Every one of those ridings that went from Liberal to Conservative, and there are not that many of them, but every one of them that went that way is an oddball.
Makes me wonder if the election was 6 weeks instead of 1 month, that the Conservatives were already gaining steam, and they may have, if
if the election had been held today, for example, I think the Conservatives would have won.
Possibly, I don't think so, but I think if it was another 2 weeks, they may certainly have won, or at least even made up a couple more seats.
And maybe what you're seeing in York and in Niagara is actually a reflection of that whole trend towards the.
When we were looking at the polls, and it looked like the Liberals were going to win a majority, we kept reminding everybody that conservative polling is never quite that accurate.
Yeah.
And that and here we were looking for either a liberal minority or a conservative minority. I think if the election was another 2 weeks longer, we may have ended up with a conservative minority.
Yep, absolutely.
So that idea that Niagara is a unique political ecosystem is a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, Ford is asking Carney to fast track Ontario resource projects after the Liberal election win.
Yes. Now the Liberals have had this reputation out west egregiously, but here also in Ontario, where they just weigh in and stall projects. The Ontario government will have an environmental assessment, then the federal government will have a federal assessment. So the idea that the Liberals have layered on way too much bureaucracy and are stalling, their policies have stalled the development of resources in Ontario, particularly the Ring of Fire, where we have all kinds of minerals and stuff that are just waiting to be pulled out of the ground, and government regulations are just bogging it all down.
Yeah, and that's the key factor here, is the critical mineral and other resource development in northwestern Ontario.
Now, the big issue here for Alberta is the same thing, and Doug Ford is speaking on behalf of Alberta a little bit here, is get those resources and get them going.
Well, Smith also makes the same point. She's calling upon Carney to reset that relationship.
Well, she points out, and this is, like I said, it's most egregious out west, but it's here also in Ontario, that when the governments have come up with unrealistic environmental controls on emissions and stuff, if they wanted to hit those targets, the only way they could hit those targets is reduce production or limit production.
Yeah.
Which is unacceptable. Okay, we have this target that we're supposed to hit, this environmental target, and we can't reach it unless we reduce the amount of oil and gas we produce. That
Well, I think that particularly with Daniel Smith and the Alberta government, there's been a total disconnect with the Trudeau government in Ottawa, and now this is a time to make that reconnect, and I'm sure Carney will, because in fact Carney's been talking about getting practical solutions to get Canada moving again.
well, the Trudeau government was hell bent on meeting these unrealistic, as she says, unrealistic uh, targets.
Yeah.
She wants 2050. Trudeau wanted 2030. It's impossible to meet any of those without just saying shutting off your production. What good is that? That
Yeah.
reduces the wealth of the province. It reduces the wealth of the country, as a matter of fact. So it was an unrealistic. It was a noble idea to reduce emissions by 2030, but it couldn't happen. But the Liberal government was trying to force it to happen
Yeah.
because they wanted to get their numbers up for the Paris climate accords. But if you are making the economy suffer for that achievement, that's convoluted. And she points that out, that she's made that argument over and over again. Also pointed out that the federal government was stepping into provincial jurisdiction.
She did. She said that on numerous occasions. In fact, that was almost her opening shot when she first became elected as Premier of Alberta.
Yeah, so quite rightly, she has pointed out that the liberal government has inhibited the development of Alberta, has fought them instead of helped them. Will Carney now uh, he has expressed the idea of making Canada and particularly Alberta a energy superpower. Well, he better start going pretty quick because the cessation movement in Alberta is gaining steam. 2/3 of Alberta voters, 2/3 of them voted for conservatives. When you look at everywhere else in the area, even here, Baldinelli won by 51 something percent or 52% of the popular vote. That's a far cry from 65%. When your people are winning their their ridings in Alberta by 65% of the vote, you know that the pretty much the total population is on the conservative side of the ideas.
Yeah.
Now, Carney, as we've pointed out,
Well,
has
in the other,
moved the Liberals to the right and has adopted a lot of talking points of the conservatives. But he's got to move, and he's got to move fast.
yeah, essentially, there were only 3 seats, I believe, in Alberta that were not won by the Conservatives, and one of those by NDP and the other two by the Liberals. And those seats were seats that were already held by them, but NDP, I think, lost 3 seats in Alberta.
Yes, and as I said before, the shift did not necessarily go to the Liberals, which they expected. It went half and half. And
Well,
when they explore the idea where the NDP vote went, the NDP vote went to the candidate that most expressed solidarity with the people who were looking for affordability and other outside of the Trump factor.
Yeah, and you look at Barnaby. Barnaby, from being a comfortable win from Jagmeet Singh, suddenly becomes Jagmeet's got 9,000 votes, whereas the Liberals and Conservatives were fighting it out for about 22. Liberals got, I think, 20,000, and the Conservatives 23.
Yeah, he wasn't even a factor in the
He
race.
wasn't even a factor in the race. He was dead from the outset, right?
Now, this is because Jagmeet Singh has proved himself to be a very poor politician and a very poor strategist. as we've pointed out before, he tore up the agreement with the Liberals, but never really did. He kept
Yeah.
supporting them, and if he had uh, went along with a non-confidence vote, he himself now would be sitting on the other side of the aisle, from Pierre Poilievre, but he would be the official opposition leader. As it is, he destroyed his own career, and he pretty much destroyed the NDP.
Yeah, he held on too long.
Yeah, he held
Yeah.
on too long, and he didn't really see what was in the cards.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the NDP completely destroyed themselves. They're going to need a new leader. They're going to have to need a whole new approach.
Okay,
And
so we're going to ask this question going back, since we're back on this general topic. Not okay. So we look back at the question about Niagara. I wonder how much, for example, the fact that the provincial polls, we had no liberal organization in Niagara Falls, Niagara on the Lake area anyway. There was zero provincial Liberal Party, and the Liberals had to have a put in, somebody from outside installed as a candidate here.
you're talking about the provincial election.
Yeah, in the provincial election. Just how much did that have an effect on Andrea Kaiser's campaign? The fact that we didn't have a local provincial organization.
I don't think so, because Andrea Kaiser was well known here. She's been in three different. This is the third election she's
It is
been in.
her third election, yes.
So she has been a prominent figure. She's well known in the area. So I don't think that had a factor at all. And the Liberals had a strong presence here. They didn't have to helicopter anyone in at all. The Liberals were strong, whereas the Liberals in the provincial were very, very weak.
Yeah.
Very, very weak.
Well, I only asked the question because I only asked the question because of course, the short gap between the two elections.
Yeah, I think basically we like no matter how much they want to point out different approaches. I think we voted for Wayne Gates because we liked Wayne Gates, and we didn't. The idea that he was an NDP and a part of a party that will not hold power in Ontario for many years to come didn't factor into it. We liked him. We liked the representation he gave us. And I think too here with Baldinelli, we like the guy. And we were not going to, we bucked the trends basically for the same reason that we just like the guy. The idea that the Conservatives had better talking points for the average Niagara voter may have been part of it, but I think mostly it's because he's an incumbent and he's well liked, just like Wayne Gates. So a person like that could survive the winds of change in the country, basically, and they did.
Okay. It's a quick question about this. One Conservative MP has basically been saying that Ford is a problem for Ontario and the country, saying that he interfered with how the Conservative Party ran their national campaign, and he shouldn't have done.
I think that's overstated, although we know that we have a feeling that wasn't just impulsive talking. It was meant to be said. So they're trying to lay the blame for the Conservatives on in Ontario, because Ontario is very important. They're trying to lay the blame on Ford for not marching in step with Poilievre. But he said from the very beginning that they were running their campaign incorrectly.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Bernie, whoever Jenny Bernie or whatever her name is, did not have her finger on the pulse. They kept doing the Trump-like populist stuff when the whole situation had changed. They didn't get their act together until later on, and that
That's
probably
very
was
true.
criticism from Ontario.
Mm.
They started to make ground after Ford and had pointed that out, that they hadn't done well in their campaigning, and they were campaigning in the wrong way. As a matter of fact, the Conservatives apparently were split in three different ideas of they could see that they were losing their lead of 25 points very rapidly, and they were at odds. Uh, three different philosophies of how to do this. Where Ford come along and said, "Look, you're just running it wrong," and when they did pivot to a more less populist ideology in their campaign, that's when they started to gain points.
Yeah.
So this fella Giannini, or I forget his name, I can't read it here, but
Giovanni.
Yeah, I think
Giovanni.
now Ford has dismissed him out of hand. We also have to notice too that the split between provincial parties and federal parties are happening in the Alberta right now. They want to disassociate the NDP in Alberta want to disassociate themselves with the federal NDP. They feel that there's an ideological difference there, that the federal NDP will not be able to see to serve the Alberta on a federal level, and the NDP in Alberta is the other strong party in Alberta. They are the other ones that have held power in Alberta.
So
we've
well, in fact, doesn't the NDP hail from Alberta originally?
Saskatchewan, I think.
Ah, okay. And
Tommy Douglas was from Saskatchewan.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and exactly the Alberta, at a provincial level, the NDP has a much higher say.
Yeah. So the other party that would could in Alberta politics or Saskatchewan politics, the other party that could come into power would be the NDP. The Liberals are almost non-existent in those areas, and we find that the NDP and the Conservatives sometimes have overlap. They right now the Conservatives are for strong, independent people that don't need the interference of government. We find the NDP follow that idea of the farmers really began, where you help your neighbor. Basically, if their combine is broken down, you and your neighbors take your combine and harvest your neighbor's crops and help them out. So that's the NDP kind of idea, that we help each other. But remember, the farmers and other people like that in the West are strongly independent, which makes the Conservatives appeal to them as well.
Yeah.
Independent, let me do what I want, get your nose out of my business. But meanwhile, if my farmer breaks down, we will do the socialist thing. We'll go over there and help him out. Right? If his barn burns down, we'll all go over there and rebuild him a barn. That's kind of the socialist network. But in the meantime, when all things are even, I'm going to farm my land. I'm going to do what I want to do, and don't stick your nose into my business, Mr. Government. That kind of thing. So I think that's the NDP. The culture
at the end of the day, where you see
both with the NDP and the Conservatives, but not so much with the Liberals.
Yeah. At the end of the day, where we sit with the provincial parliament, you've got 49 Conservative and 38 NDP, and the Liberals don't factor in. Whereas in the federal election, all but 3 seats were won by the Conservatives.
Yeah, and like I said, the popular vote was 65%
Yeah,
for
yeah,
conservative.
yeah, for conservatives. So clearly, clearly, I think Daniel Smith's right that she has to get this kind of. We have to. She has to hit the reset button. She has to get that Ottawa Alberta relationship working again, and to some extent, it's the duty is upon her to do so.
I think it's on Carney, and he's got to work fast, and he's got to give the Albertans and Saskatchewan people confidence that he really is in their corner. This whole idea of the federal Liberals stifling the economic growth of Alberta and Saskatchewan because they can't make up the emissions that they were looking for in Ontario and Quebec, which were industrialized. You can't really say, okay, stop making steel, but they can go out west and say, okay, stop making oil. And
Yeah,
it's ridiculous. We got these targets to meet, and this is the only place we can do it. And that means we'll have to reduce the amount of oil
all right.
being produced here.
Yeah. All right, we're going to have to call it quits on that one today.
Yeah, so I think even though I'm not really hip, I don't really like a lot of Daniel Smith's political ideas, but she is absolutely correct there, and we have to. And the Liberals have not served the West very well, and this is Carney's time to show that that's changed.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Okay, and I would just like to say, as always, please remember Gaza. That is still going on. It's horrific, and I would just like to say that we should not forget that 1 minute. That's a terrible thing, genocide going on there, and the West has kind of turned their backs on it, and we've all been focusing on other things. But don't forget that it has to be resolved, and
Yeah.
I don't see any end in sight. But don't let it get off your mind. And without further ado, I bid you adieu. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah.